Hello. Why are you here? I come to eBay Open each year hoping that I'm going to be challenged. I want someone to question everything I do. What, how, when, with who. Nothing's really sacred. I want to leave the event with some different ideas. I mean, the event fails if I just end up carrying on making the same mistakes year after year. How about you? Do any of your listings fail to create confidence in your product, not establish trust between buyer and seller, or maybe just sell for less than the item is worth? Hello, my name's Philip Jackson, and I've been specializing in finding underperforming eBay listings for over 20 years. I've been a full-time connoisseur of bad listings for 14 years, and I've spent over $2 million of my own money on some really badly listed items, mostly in professional electronics categories. But simply, I buy low on eBay and I sell high on eBay. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be hosting a Q&A session after the meeting. And if you want more ideas from me, then check out our podcast, the Selling on eBay radio show at sellsellsell.online and at your favorite podcast provider. My selling approach is to take my experiences on eBay as a buyer and use those to guide me as a seller. And I'd encourage you to also think like a buyer. And that's our theme today. I want to create value in the buyer's mind by showing that I understand their needs and that I can provide the right solution. I think about the transaction from their point of view. What questions, concerns, or reservations do they have that might lower the price? And then I address those in my listing so they can hit the buy button there and then. And remember, it's a subjective purchasing choice based upon perceptions about the product and, equally importantly, about the seller. A good listing manages those perceptions. So how do we use our understanding of our buyer to create confidence in our product? Buyers hate disappointments or surprises. It's so important to show photos of the actual item you're selling. Take some time to get the item to look as close to new as possible. Most sellers don't bother. Dirty fingerprints and label residue seem to get magnified by the camera lens. Windex is great for a quick wipe over to remove dirt and grease. I use Goo Gone to remove that tape and label residue, and isopropyl alcohol that gets rid of grime or sticky stuff whilst not damaging surfaces. And there are a plethora of car detailing products that can make plastic or painted surfaces gleam like new. Personally, I try and sell what I know, so items that I've invested the time to understand and that I know I can test fully and show working. And good pictures sell. But what's good these days? Imaging standards keep on rising. It's another chance to get ahead or be left behind. But don't worry, there's help available. Check out your local eBay meetup group. Ask others there how they take their pictures. Maybe find a friendly photographer to guide you or your group. And most conveniently, there's YouTube. All the techniques you'll see me using here were learned by watching someone on YouTube. Here's some basic tips for great photos. Firstly, keep a static setup for your photos using artificial light sources. You'll never get consistent results if everything is changing session to session. If you have a real camera with dials, then it probably should be on manual exposure with pretty much the same settings being used all the time. Lighting makes way more difference to product image quality than the camera. So spend your money on that. And there are really only 3 secrets to great product lighting. Firstly, lots of light is good, and more than lots is better. Your camera lens, sensor, shutter speed, autofocus, viewfinder all work better when there's lots of light. But just use the same type of lights throughout for consistency of color. Secondly, you want your light to be non-directional. In other words, even with no part of the image brighter than any other, and the light to come from the front. That removes shadows that can hide important details. And lastly, photographers love using diffuse light. That's when light from a small source is bounced off a large white surface to make the light source appear much bigger. And if you recall the last time you saw a photo studio, they probably had softboxes or umbrellas on their lights, and those are just ways of making a small point source of light much bigger. And if you have a light cube, then that's exactly what the cube is doing to the tiny LED lights along the edges. And they work really well. Maybe you prefer to use a phone or tablet. They have really good cameras these days. But if the lens is covered in fingerprints, then those blurry shots won't get you the sale. A simple $3 microfiber cleaning cloth will clean those off the lens without damaging the surface. For buyers, an appealing photo is key to nailing that sale. Search results show the item title, condition, and your first image. And it's that image that makes you stand out from everybody else. Personally, I try and make that tell my story as much as possible. I like to show everything that's included in the listing in that one image. It tells the buyer that everything they need will be in the box. But do take the time to make a neat arrangement, because that shows you care enough to take a few extra moments. If stuff is inclined to roll around the table, then a little blob of tacky putty hidden behind the errant object is great for temporarily holding it in place. Another way of telling your story is to speak to the buyer graphically. That's a much more powerful channel of communication than by text, and also it gets way more visibility on eBay. So here, I'm trying to communicate the upgrades that I've made and the results that the buyer will obtain. And you're right, it's a little busy and it's far from artistic, but I'm trying to squeeze a lot of points into a small image. Hopefully I've succeeded. If you do something like this, then do monitor the listing quality report from time to time for any Google problems. But in my experience, there's a lot of latitude at the moment, so you really can get creative. So I think I know what you're thinking. Well, I can't possibly get to the point of combining multiple images and telling a story. Well, that's what I said for years. I thought that digital editing was just too complicated and that you needed a PhD in Photoshop to produce anything. I admit I was wrong. I finally gave in. I watched some YouTube videos and discovered that after just a couple of experiments, it really wasn't as hard as I feared. And I now do this routinely, and it's quick. It's also something that none of your competition are going to bother to replicate. So it really does make you stand out in search. I don't know whether you've seen that Google now shows the second image when you put your mouse over the item on their page. So maybe it's time to give some thought to which images you put in position number 2 that will receive that extra visibility. A white background. It makes your listing look so much more professional. See how much cleaner and integrated into the page it looks. It looks to the subconscious like eBay is pushing my item. And with the current set of AI-based background cleanup tools, it's easier than ever to achieve. So here's a tip for getting your backgrounds white. Basic physics says that if a subject is halfway between the camera and the background, as shown here, then the background surprisingly only gets 1/4 of the light that the subject does. So even if that background is actually white, it's going to appear as a rather mid-gray in the final image. The remedy is actually simple. You just add extra light to the background only. Play with the amount of light so the background goes almost white. Don't add too much, otherwise you'll be shining a bright light right back into the camera lens, which you don't want to do. It doesn't need to be perfect either, just good enough that your background removal tool can do its thing. Okay, let's go back now to our buyer's thought process. Is the person selling committed to delivering a good buying experience? And as you start to sell pricier stuff, this becomes really important. And hey, who wouldn't mind a bit of extra cash from each sale? So every eBay seller is different, and the buyer therefore forms a view about the seller when making a purchase. Personally, I like to add a quick, informative first paragraph that gives the buyer all the must-knows about the item, but maybe more importantly, to show that I understand the product enough to be trusted, and that I understand the questions that are going through their mind. I want us both to be on the same team as well as reading off the same page. So I think that for a substantial sale, it is important to establish your expertise and to demonstrate your credentials. Some buyers will want to do a bit of background research on you as a seller. I mean, that's good. It means they're interested. The first place they may look is your eBay storefront. Have you invested any time in making this look professional? I hired a graphic artist to help me with mine. I mean, that's an investment to provide reassurance that I'm a serious seller and that I'm committed to taking care of my buyers. And while in your store, buyers may take a look at the kind of stuff you sell. Is the item they want a one-off for you, or do you have experience and depth in that category? I've tried to organize my store to show that I work with the main brands in my categories and that I can therefore provide useful advice to someone who needs help making the right choice. The eBay store also shows your feedback, and of course, disagreements sometimes happen, and it's usually over the smallest sales, right? I set money aside to make things right, and I will spend it to keep my stats where I want them. Isn't it worth spending a little to avoid buyers going off your listing to research feedback comments, because some of them will forget to come back and complete that purchase? And like you, I take any negative feedback incredibly personally. I feel that it undermines that trust I've worked so hard to create. I mean, the good news is that offering paid returns gives you feedback protection, and I personally love that reassurance. I can now sleep at night. And lastly, avoid undoing all your hard work by cluttering your store with cheap or personal stuff that doesn't really fit with your professional brand. We want the highest possible price, right? So what things drive those sales at the high end of the range? Do you evaluate other eBay sellers? I know I do. Do they take care in the way that they communicate through their listing? Is the layout logical, easy to read, and written by someone who is knowledgeable? I mean, AI-produced content, it sounds interesting, but will it do a better job than a few relevant bullet points written by a knowledgeable seller? I think it's really important to demonstrate that buyer satisfaction is included by you at no cost. I know you hate returns, because I hate returns. So why then would I recommend that you take free returns? In all honesty, in my experience, the incremental return rate is very small. And I find that's more than paid for by the discount in fees from eBay, assuming that you qualify. And if we're being honest, if a buyer is unhappy, the item's probably coming back to you anyway, most likely on your dime. So surely it's better to take the credit for something you're forced to do anyway. Plus, there's that feedback protection we mentioned. Don't lower trust by over-promising. I think mint is used way too often, and new really should mean new. And how you answer buyers' questions, it's a big opportunity to show your professionalism. Okay, let's face it, branding yourself on eBay is very hard because most of what the buyer sees is owned and managed by eBay. What matters most is how you appear on the search results page, as that's where the purchasing decision begins. I mean, one of the fixes I apply to underperforming listings is to communicate more visually, as you may have gathered, and to do so in a common visual style so that in search results I stand out as having depth of product in that category. In this example, one seller clearly has 2 of the 4 items shown. Well, that's me. And I'm hoping that a buyer looking for an experienced seller will pick one of my listings for the next step. And you're asking, what puts listings at the bottom end of the price range? Well, I make a good living buying off people who make listing mistakes. So please, from me, just carry on making these mistakes. Firstly, unreasonable shipping charges. I know what it costs to print a label, and I hate paying more to a greedy or just plain incompetent seller, and I am not alone in that. And by the way, don't forget, put the cheapest option in the number 1 slot, as that's what gets used to show the total cost to the buyer and rank you in some search results. Better still, offer free shipping. Now, of course, we all know there's no such thing as free shipping, just shipping that isn't broken out separately. So again, let's look at it from the buyer's point of view. By not showing it separately, it removes a major distraction. another decision that has to be made, and maybe a reason to go and check out other listings. It also takes away a lot of those annoying pre-sale questions. I'm honestly not asking you to make any less money. If you're an experienced seller and you're attending this event, right, then you should be able to factor in shipping into the price and cover your costs on average. I'd just like to suggest that you maybe test it and just see if it increases sales and reduces your friction. A no returns listing is asking the buyer to assume risk. Now, risk always equals a lower price. So take it from me, as a buyer, returning something is a hassle. It's a waste of my time. I'm only going to make a return as a last resort, but I will pay you a higher price to have that option. I hate auctions with a reserve because the seller is asking me, as a buyer, to do a lot of technical research to come up with a valuation, and I might well be the high bidder. But all that effort may end up being wasted, so it's a barrier. If you have some adverse feedback, then how you answer those comments is actually probably more important than the remarks themselves. And if something has to fit, then leaving out the dimensions is guaranteed to kill sales. And I hate reading lots of warnings, rules, terms, and conditions embedded in listings. It's just a big red flag and a major distraction to me as a buyer. It's a big turnoff. So whether you like it or not, the rules are set by the marketplace. So cluttering your listing with your alternative terms won't change any outcome other than just depressing the price. So we've looked at our listing from the buyer's perspective. We've maybe fixed a vague product description and maybe built some trust between buyer and seller. Can we raise our price? Well, firstly, most buyers aren't going to do the same price research that you do. Rather, it's better to think about the value that isn't being created by the competition and filling that void. If you do sold item research, then great, but run a tight filter so that you're comparing apples to apples. And having research data is a bit of a double-edged sword. It's so tempting just to copy someone else's approach and skip the stage where you stand back and figure out what the buyer really cares about. If you've got a warehouse full of old iPhone 10s, well, then you're probably more interested in achieving a target sell-through rate than getting the highest price on every phone. Anytime I see a price of, let's say, $19.99 or whatever, I think the sellers plucked the number out of the air, and I'm thinking their real price must be lower. So how do we justify a higher than average price? Creating value in the buyer's world is more important than beating some other seller's price. So for the stuff that I sell, most of it has to be installed somewhere, usually. So I want the buyer to be able to see their way through that task on the listing page, to envisage it sitting in their environment, to be thinking, yeah, I can get that working, no problem. So I show the connections they may need to make, I document any compatibility requirements, or anything else that takes away doubt about the usability of the item. Before listing an item, I like to make sure that everything that's needed is included. I'll go out and buy the missing parts if necessary. And I'll try and make it clear in that first image that everything necessary is in the box. But don't overdo it. Bundling unrelated items just adds to shipping costs and probably no incremental value to the buyer. Maximizing price for you is a case of minimizing risk for the buyer. What can you do to remove any uncertainty? Can you communicate that in an image? So in this listing, I'm showing that the required antenna is included, that the unit's been powered up and responds as expected, and that I have the detailed performance test results to prove that it works. I'm very happy selling at prices on the high side. After all, I'm in no hurry to make the sale. And I feel I'm offering a better solution than someone with less knowledge and experience. Buyers' questions are an opportunity for me to show that I understand the product and that I'm responsive. Even though, of course, most questions are already answered in the listing. Get the basics right and provide a high standard of customer support. Enough said? And like you, I get my share of low-ball offers, even though I've never asked for any. And I always decline, as that's not my target market. I'm more than busy enough taking orders from on-target customers at the asking price. which, by the way, includes room for me to make right any problems that occur. And mistakes will, of course, occasionally happen. And I think it's important and more reassuring to the buyer if you just admit an error without trying to pass the blame and, of course, fix their issue. So, let's summarize. Get inside your buyer's head. Your listing should be a multi-layered, cohesive argument that you have the product knowledge and experience and service wrap necessary to delight your buyer. You should remove as many purchasing risks, decisions, and complications as possible. And by better responding to the customer's needs than your competition, you can justify your price at the higher end of the range. Thank you very much for your time today. I'll be available for your questions and comments in the Q&A session now. I also hope that we'll stay in touch and that you'll join Sherry Smith and me on our podcast, the Selling on eBay radio show at sellsellsell.online and from the usual podcast providers. I'll see you there.